November 8th, 1942. Oran, French North Africa. Feldwebel Konrad Eisner of the 5th Panzer Regiment crouched behind a shattered stone wall, his hands trembling as he reloaded his Karabiner 98K. The mathematics did not make sense. They could not make sense. His squad had ambushed an American patrol. 8 men. He had counted them clearly through his binoculars before giving the order to fire. 8 Americans against 12 Germans, caught in the open on a road with no cover. It should have been a slaughter. Instead, Eisner had lost 4 men in the first 15 seconds. The American rifles had not stopped firing. Not the disciplined crack-pause crack of bolt-action weapons that Eisner had heard from British Lee Enfields in the desert. The rhythm of war, he understood. Aim, fire, work the bolt. Aim again. The Americans produced something else entirely, a continuous rolling thunder, shot after shot after shot, so fast that Eisner's first thought was machine guns. But machine guns had a different sound, a different cadence. This was rifle fire. It had to be rifle fire, but no rifle could fire that fast. "How many are there?" Obergefreiter Wendt screamed from behind a burned-out truck, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. Eisner had counted 8. He was certain he had counted 8. A company, he heard himself say. At least a company, maybe more. He risked a glance over the wall. The Americans were advancing now, moving from cover to cover with their weapons shouldered, and the fire never stopped, never paused for the bolt manipulation that should have given his men time to aim, time to breathe, time to fight back. One single American, sent 5 rounds downrange in the time it took Wendt to chamber a fresh cartridge. "Fall back," Eisner shouted. "Fall back now." Later, at the battalion aid station, Eisner filed his after-action report. He described an engagement with a reinforced American company, approximately 120 men, equipped with automatic or semi-automatic weapons of unknown type. His commanding officer, Hauptmann Dieter Brandt, read the report with visible skepticism. "You engaged a company and survived with 8 men? They had overwhelming firepower, Herr Hauptmann. Automatic weapons. Every man." Brandt set down the report. "American infantry are equipped with the Springfield rifle. Bolt action. 5 rounds. The same as our carabiner." He tapped the paper. "You were ambushed by a patrol, Feldwebel. You panicked. It happens to new men in their first engagement." Eisner said nothing. He knew what he had heard. He knew what he had seen. What neither man understood, what the entire Wehrmacht would spend the next 3 years learning, was that the Americans had not been carrying Springfield rifles. They had been carrying something else. Something that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of infantry combat. Something that would make every American rifleman the equivalent of 3 German soldiers. The weapon was called the M1 Garand, and by the time the war ended, German soldiers would know its sound better than their own heartbeats. They would learn to call it the sound of dying. The German confidence in their infantry weapons was not arrogance. It was doctrine refined through decades of war. The Karabiner 98K, the standard rifle of the Wehrmacht, represented the pinnacle of bolt-action design, derived from the Gewehr 98 that had armed Kaiser Wilhelm's armies in the Great War. It was accurate to 500 meters in trained hands, reliable in mud and sand and snow, and mechanically simple enough that a conscript could maintain it in the field. German soldiers trained extensively with the weapon, learning to work the bolt with fluid efficiency to deliver aimed fire at rates approaching 15 rounds per minute. The rifle had proven itself across Poland, France, the Low Countries, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. It had killed millions. More importantly, German tactical doctrine did not rely on rifle firepower for infantry dominance. The Wehrmacht had learned a different lesson from the trenches of 1914 to 1918. That the machine gun was the decisive weapon of modern infantry combat. German squads were built around the MG-34 and its successor, the devastating MG-42, weapons capable of delivering 1,200 rounds per minute in sustained bursts. The rifleman existed to support the machine gun, to protect it, to carry ammunition for it, to maneuver it into positions where its killing power could be unleashed. "The rifle is a defensive weapon," wrote General Major Hans von Luck in his 1941 Tactical Manual for Armored Infantry. "The machine gun is the offensive weapon. A squad without its machine gun is a squad without teeth." A squad without its riflemen is merely inconvenienced. This philosophy had crushed every army the Wehrmacht faced. Polish cavalry had charged into MG-34 fire and been annihilated. French defensive positions had been suppressed by machine gun teams, while riflemen maneuvered to flanking positions. British infantry in the desert had learned to fear the distinctive ripping sound of the MG-42, so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous tearing noise that soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw. Against this proven system, the bolt-action rifles of enemy infantry were merely a nuisance. British Lee Enfields fired slightly faster than the Karabiner 98K. The British trained their soldiers in mad-minute drills that could produce 30 aimed shots in 60 seconds, but this marginal advantage had never proven decisive. Soviet Mosin Nagants were accurate but slow. The mathematics of infantry combat remained constant. Machine guns killed, rifles supported, artillery decided. Oberst Werner Hecht of the Wehrmacht's Infantry Weapons Development Office summarized the prevailing view in a 1941 memorandum. Semi-automatic rifles offer theoretical advantages in rate of fire, but impose unacceptable penalties in weight, complexity, and ammunition consumption. A soldier with a semi-automatic rifle will expend his ammunition in minutes rather than hours. He will jam his weapon through rapid firing in dusty or muddy conditions. He will lose accuracy in pursuit of speed. The bolt-action rifle, properly employed, remains the optimal individual weapon for the German infantryman. The memorandum acknowledged that the Americans were fielding a semi-automatic rifle. Intelligence reports had confirmed the adoption of something called the M1, but dismissed its significance. American industrial capacity allows them to absorb inefficiencies that would cripple other armies, Hecht wrote. They may equip their soldiers with complex, ammunition-hungry weapons because they can afford to. This does not make such weapons effective. In sustained combat, German discipline and German machine guns will prove decisive, as they always have. The logic was sound. The experience was real. The conclusion was catastrophically wrong. What German doctrine failed to anticipate, what no European army had ever confronted, was an enemy that had given every rifleman the firepower of a machine gun crew. The Americans had not merely adopted a semi-automatic rifle, they had rebuilt the mathematics of infantry combat from the ground up, and in November 1942, that new mathematics was walking off transport ships onto the beaches of North Africa, 8 rounds in every magazine, ready to teach the Wehrmacht a lesson it would never forget. The rifle that would reshape infantry warfare was born in the mind of a Canadian immigrant who had never fired a shot in combat. Jean-Cantius Garand arrived at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts in 1919, a 31-year-old tool and gauge maker with an obsession. He had spent years studying the problem that had haunted military engineers since the invention of the self-contained metallic cartridge. How to harness the energy of a fired round to load the next one automatically. Others had tried, others had failed. Garand believed he could succeed where they had not. The bolt-action rifle is a 19th century weapon, Garand wrote in his personal notes, preserved in the Springfield Armory archives. It requires the soldier to perform 4 distinct mechanical operations between shots: lift, pull, push, lock, operations that consume time and attention that should be devoted to aiming and firing. The rifle of the 20th century must eliminate these operations. It must allow the soldier to focus entirely on his target. It must fire as fast as he can pull the trigger. The challenge was immense. A semi-automatic rifle had to cycle reliably under battlefield conditions: mud, sand, snow, extreme heat, extreme cold. It had to handle the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge, a round that generated pressures exceeding 50,000 pounds per square inch. It had to be simple enough for an 18-year-old conscript to maintain in the field, light enough to carry on long marches, accurate enough to hit targets at 500 yards, and it had to do all of this while remaining cheap enough to produce in the millions. Garand spent the next 17 years solving these problems, one by one. His breakthrough came through a mechanism he called the gas-operated rotating bolt. A small port in the barrel captured a portion of the propellant gases from each fired round and channeled them into a cylinder beneath the barrel. These gases drove a piston backward, which in turn rotated and unlocked the bolt, extracted the spent cartridge, and allowed a spring to push the next round into the chamber. The entire cycle took less than 1/10 of a second. The soldier's only job was to pull the trigger again. The first prototype was completed in 1924. It failed. The second prototype in 1926 also failed. Garand rebuilt the design, tested it, watched it malfunction, and rebuilt it again. He worked through the Depression while funding dried up, and Army bureaucrats questioned whether the project was worth continuing. He competed against rival designs: the Peterson rifle, the Bang rifle, the Thompson autoloading rifle, and watched each of them fail the brutal endurance test that the Army demanded. Mr. Garand was not a man who accepted defeat, recalled Colonel Rene Studler, who oversaw the rifle trials at Aberdeen Proving Ground. I saw him receive test results that would have crushed another engineer. Catastrophic failures, barrels that burst, receivers that cracked. He would nod, make notes, and return to his workshop. 6 months later, he would be back with a new prototype. He never complained. He never made excuses. He simply solved the problem. On January 9, 1936, the United States Army officially adopted the U.S. rifle, caliber .30 M1. It was the first semi-automatic rifle ever adopted as a standard infantry weapon by any military force in the world. The specifications were remarkable. Weight: 9.5 pounds, comparable to the Springfield M1903 it replaced. Length: 43.5 inches. Effective range: 500 yards. Rate of fire: 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute, more than 3 times the rate of any bolt-action rifle in service. Magazine capacity: 8 rounds in an en-bloc clip that ejected automatically when empty, producing a distinctive metallic ping that would become one of the most recognizable sounds of the war. But the numbers only told part of the story. What made the Garand revolutionary was not merely its rate of fire, but what that rate of fire allowed the American soldier to do. He could suppress an enemy position without a machine gun. He could deliver accurate fire while moving. He could engage multiple targets in seconds rather than being forced to choose between them. He could survive encounters that would have killed a man with a bolt-action rifle, because he could shoot back faster than his enemy could chamber a fresh round. General George S. Patton, never a man given to understated praise, would later call the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. He was not exaggerating. But in 1936, the rifle existed only in prototype and promise. The Springfield Armory had to learn how to manufacture it in quantities the Army demanded. The Army had to train millions of soldiers to use it, and the world had to provide a war in which to prove it. All three would come soon enough. The rifle that would win a war almost died in a Massachusetts factory. Springfield Armory had been producing bolt-action rifles since 1903. The M1 Garand was something else entirely, a weapon with 72 distinct parts compared to the Springfield rifle's 58, each machined to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. The gas cylinder had to be bored with absolute precision, or the operating rod would bind. The receiver required 14 separate machining operations. The trigger group alone contained springs and pins so small that workers lost them on the factory floor. Production began in 1937 at a rate that can only be described as glacial. In the first year, Springfield Armory produced fewer than 1,000 rifles. In 1938, they managed 5,000. Military planners who had projected a requirement of over 1 million rifles watched the numbers with growing alarm. At this rate, the Army would still be waiting for Garands when the next war ended. The weapon is too complex for mass production, declared Colonel Gruber Whitfield of the Ordnance Department in a 1939 memorandum. We should consider reverting to the M1903 Springfield as our primary infantry rifle and relegating the Garand to specialized units. The logistics of supporting 2 different rifle calibers and operating systems in a combat theater are manageable. The logistics of fighting a war with rifles we cannot manufacture are not. The problems extended beyond production. Early Garands shipped to training units began returning with troubling defect reports. Gas cylinders cracked after sustained firing. Operating rods bent under the stress of repeated cycling. The N-block clip, the distinctive 8-round ammunition holder, sometimes failed to eject properly, jamming the weapon at the worst possible moment. Soldiers who had trained on the reliable, familiar Springfield rifle looked at the Garand with suspicion. "We called it the Jammin' Jenny at Fort Benning," recalled Private First Class Harold Reeves, who trained with the rifle in 1940. "You'd be on the range, firing beautiful, and then click, nothing. Dead rifle." The instructors told us it was user error, that we were riding the operating rod or not seating the clip properly. Maybe they were right. But a rifle that needs perfect technique to function isn't a rifle you want to trust your life to. The skepticism reached the highest levels of the Army. Major General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces and one of the most influential officers in the service, advocated publicly for canceling the Garand program. The semi-automatic rifle encourages wasteful ammunition expenditure, he argued in a 1941 staff meeting. A soldier who can fire 50 rounds per minute will fire 50 rounds per minute, whether he has targets or not. Our logistics system is not designed to sustain this rate of consumption. We will win battles and lose wars because our ammunition ships cannot keep pace with our infantry. German intelligence monitored the American rifle program with professional interest and arrived at similar conclusions. A 1940 assessment from the Waffenamt, the Wehrmacht's weapons development office, analyzed the M1 Garand based on technical specifications obtained through neutral sources. The American semi-automatic rifle represents an ambitious but impractical design. Its complexity ensures high manufacturing costs and low production volumes. Its gas operation system will be vulnerable to dust, mud, and debris, conditions that are universal in combat. Its 8-round capacity is inferior to the German 15-round detachable magazine system. Most critically, the distinctive sound produced when the empty clip ejects will signal to nearby enemy soldiers that the American rifleman's weapon is empty, creating a tactical vulnerability with no countermeasure. We do not recommend development of an equivalent system. The Carabiner 98K, properly employed, remains superior. The ping would become famous and the source of one of the war's most persistent myths. German soldiers, the story went, would listen for the sound of an ejecting clip and rush the American position during the reload. In reality, the chaos of combat made such tactics nearly impossible. The ping was inaudible beyond a few meters in any engagement involving more than a handful of rifles. But in 1940, the concern seemed legitimate, another mark against an unproven weapon. By December 1941, when Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the United States Army possessed approximately 600,000 M1 Garands, barely enough to equip half the force that would need them. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers shipped overseas carrying Springfield M1903 rifles, the bolt-action weapon the Garand was supposed to replace. The great semi-automatic revolution existed more in theory than in practice. And then American industry did what American industry does. Winchester received contracts to supplement Springfield Armory's production. New factories spun up in months rather than years. Assembly line techniques borrowed from the automotive industry transformed rifle manufacturing. By mid-1942, Garands were rolling off production lines at rates that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. By 1943, every American infantryman in every theater was carrying Garand's rifle. The Wehrmacht would soon discover what that meant. But first, in the deserts of North Africa, the rifle would have to prove itself, not in factory tests or training exercises, but in the brutal arithmetic of combat, where the only measure that mattered was who lived and who died. February 19, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Staff Sergeant Raymond Dunn of the 1st Infantry Division's 26th Regiment lay prone behind a limestone outcropping, his M1 Garand warm against his cheek. 200 yards down the slope, German infantry were massing for another assault. Panzer Grenadiers of the 10th Panzer Division, veterans of France and the Eastern Front, men who had been killing Allied soldiers since before most Americans knew where Tunisia was on a map. Dunn had been fighting for 3 days without sleep. He had watched his platoon shrink from 42 men to 19. He had seen American armor burn on the valley floor, Shermans brewing up like gasoline cans under the guns of German panzers. Kasserine was a disaster. the first major engagement between American and German ground forces, and the Americans were losing badly. But Dunn had noticed something in those 3 days, something the after-action reports wouldn't capture, something that would matter more than any tank or artillery piece. The Germans were afraid to advance, not afraid in the abstract sense. They were brave soldiers, disciplined, well-led, but every time they formed up for an assault, every time they rose from cover to close the distance, American rifle fire scythed through their ranks with a volume and intensity that stopped them cold. They would hit the ground, return fire, wait for the American fusillade to slacken. It never slackened. It never paused for the bolt manipulation that German tactical doctrine expected. It just kept coming. 8 rounds, ping, reload, 8 more rounds, a continuous stream of aimed fire that made crossing open ground suicidal. "They're bunching up again," Private First Class Anthony Messina said, peering through binoculars. 60, maybe 70. Officer in front with a pistol. Dunn counted the Americans on his section of the line. 11 men, 11 Garands, 88 rounds before anyone needed to reload. "Wait until they're in the open," Dunn said. "Then give them everything." The German officer blew his whistle. The Panzer Grenadiers rose and began to advance, rifles at port arms, moving in the efficient bounding overwatch pattern that had carried them across Europe. The officer was shouting encouragement, his Luger raised. Dunn exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The M1 bucked against his shoulder, the .3006 round crossing 200 yards in a quarter second. The German officer spun and fell. Dunn shifted aim, fired again, shifted, fired again. Beside him, 10 other Americans did the same. The sound was not the crack, crack, crack of bolt actions trading fire. It was a roar, a continuous, rolling thunder that merged 11 rifles into what sounded like 100. The German assault lasted 9 seconds. Dunn watched through the haze of gunsmoke as the surviving Panzer Grenadiers threw themselves behind rocks, into depressions, anywhere that offered cover from the impossible volume of fire. He counted bodies on the slope. 14, 15, 17 Germans who had been running forward moments ago and would never run anywhere again. His rifle pinged. He thumbed in a fresh clip and resumed firing at movement. The Germans did not try again, not on his section, not that day. Gefreiter Wilhelm Strasser of the 10th Panzer Division's Panzer Grenadier Regiment was one of the men who had thrown himself behind a rock when the American fire began. His account, recorded in a letter to his wife that was later captured by Allied intelligence, described the moment in terms that revealed the psychological impact of the Garand. "We were told the Americans were soft, poorly trained, easy to break. We advanced as we always advance, confident in our experience. Then the firing began, and I understood nothing. I had fought the Russians at Smolensk. I had fought the British at Tobruk. I have never heard rifle fire like this, so fast, so continuous, so accurate. Muller fell beside me with 3 holes in his chest before I could take 2 steps. I thought we had walked into a battalion. When I reached cover and looked back at the American position, I counted fewer than a dozen muzzle flashes. 12 men. 12 men produced the fire of 50. Their rifles are not like our rifles. I do not know what they are, but they are not rifles as we understand the word." The intelligence value of captured letters like Strasser's took weeks to reach Allied commanders, but the soldiers themselves understood immediately. At Kasserine Pass, despite the tactical defeat, despite the retreat, the lost equipment, the Green troops broken by their first taste of German combined arms warfare, something had worked. The rifle had worked. "We lost a lot of fights in Tunisia," Staff Sergeant Dunn wrote in his journal after the battle. "But I never saw the Germans charge us and win. We'd lose to tanks, we'd lose to artillery, we'd get flanked, run out of ammo, get cut off. But when it was rifles against rifles, when it was us looking at them and them looking at us, they couldn't close. They couldn't get across the open ground. That Garand, that beautiful, perfect Garand, gave every one of us the firepower of a machine gun team. The Germans knew it. You could see it in how they moved, how they hesitated, how they looked for another way around instead of coming through us." The lessons of Kasserine Pass would be studied for decades. Most analyses focused on American failures, poor coordination, untested leadership, inadequate armor doctrine. These critiques were valid, But buried in the after-action reports was another truth, one that German commanders understood better than American ones. The American infantry rifle had fundamentally changed the equation of ground combat. Major Gerhard Henke of the 10th Panzer Division's operations staff wrote a tactical assessment in March 1943 that would prove prophetic. The American semi-automatic rifle provides individual soldiers with a rate of fire previously achievable only by automatic weapons. This has significant implications for assault tactics. Standard approaches that assume suppression by fire superiority may fail against American infantry positions, even when numerical advantage is present. The volume of defensive fire exceeds anything in our experience against Western forces. Recommend increased emphasis on armored and artillery support for infantry operations against American units. Direct infantry assault should be considered a last resort. The recommendation was sound. The Wehrmacht would spend the next 2 years trying to follow it. They would not always succeed. The Garand came ashore at Sicily in July 1943. It waded through the surf at Salerno in September. It climbed the mountains at Monte Cassino through the winter of 1944, freezing in foxholes alongside the men who carried it, never jamming, never failing, always ready to deliver 8 rounds of .30-06 into German soldiers who had started to dread the sound of American rifles more than American artillery. And then it came to Normandy, June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, 0645 hours. Unteroffizier Klaus Brenner of the 352nd Infantry Division manned an MG-42 position in Widerstands Nest 62, overlooking the section of beach the Americans would call Easy Red. He had been firing for nearly an hour. The water below was thick with bodies, the sand dark with blood, the obstacles tangled with the dead and the dying. This was the killing that German doctrine promised. Machine guns scything through infantry caught in the open, bolt-action rifles irrelevant against men who couldn't shoot back while they drowned. Then, the Americans reached the seawall. Brenner watched through the smoke as a cluster of soldiers, perhaps 30, survivors of a company that had numbered 200 when it loaded into the Higgins boats, pressed themselves against the concrete barrier. They were supposed to be broken. Every tactical model said they should be broken. They had crossed 200 meters of open beach under interlocking machine gun fire. Half their officers were dead. Their radios were waterlogged. Their unit cohesion had been shattered by the tides and the obstacles and the slaughter. They were not broken. A sergeant stood up. Brenner could see the stripes even at this distance, and began firing his rifle at the German positions. Not aimed fire in the traditional sense. Not the slow, deliberate marksmanship of a man with a bolt-action weapon. He fired as fast as he could pull the trigger, 8 rounds in perhaps 3 seconds, the muzzle climbing slightly with each shot. Then a pause so brief Brenner almost missed it. Then 8 more. Other Americans rose beside him and did the same. The volume of fire that erupted from 30 survivors behind a seawall struck Brenner's position like a physical force. Bullets cracked past his aperture. Chips of concrete sprayed his face. His loader, Gefreiter Adler, screamed and fell backward, clutching his throat where a round had found the narrow gap in their fortification. Brenner ducked below the firing slit, his hands shaking, his mind trying to process what he had just witnessed. 30 men. 30 American rifles, and for 5 seconds, his machine gun, his beautiful, devastating 1,200 round per minute MG-42 had been suppressed by rifle fire. It was impossible, Brenner said in a post-war interview conducted by U.S. Army historians. I had fired machine guns at British infantry, at Canadian infantry. They would take cover under our fire and wait for artillery or tanks to suppress us. These Americans, these men who had just walked through hell, they suppressed us with their rifles. They stood in the open and fired so fast that I could not raise my head. 30 men with rifles matched my machine gun. I did not understand it then. I am not sure I understand it now. The seawall was only the beginning. As American forces pushed inland, the Garand's dominance became a constant in after-action reports from every sector of the Western Front. German commanders who had spent years perfecting infantry tactics against bolt-action enemies found their assumptions shattered engagement after engagement. Hedgerow Country, July 1944. The bocage of Normandy should have favored the defenders. Dense hedgerows providing perfect ambush positions, narrow lanes channeling attackers into kill zones. Instead, American infantry overwhelmed German ambushes through sheer volume of return fire. A squad caught in a German kill zone could put over 200 rounds downrange in the first 30 seconds of contact, suppressing positions that expected to fire without answer. Hauptmann Ernst Vogler of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division wrote in his field diary, "We prepared a perfect ambush at the crossroads near St. Lo, 12 men with rifles and 2 MG-42s. A full American platoon walked into our kill zone. We opened fire. And then something happened that I have never seen in 4 years of war. The Americans did not take cover. They turned toward us and attacked. They charged directly into our guns, firing as they ran, and the fire was so heavy that my machine gunners could not aim. We killed perhaps 8 of them. The rest overran our position in less than 2 minutes. I escaped with 3 men. The Americans lost 1 squad. We lost everything." The Hurtgen Forest, November 1944. The Germans fortified the forest with bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire. It became a slaughterhouse for both sides, but American infantry consistently broke through defensive positions that should have held for days. The key was close-quarters violence in the forest gloom, where engagement ranges dropped to 50 meters or less, where a soldier who could fire 8 aim shots in 4 seconds lived, and a soldier who needed 12 seconds to fire 5 shots died. Lieutenant Friedrich Schultz, captured near Schmidt, told his interrogators, "In the forest, your rifle decides if you live. My men carried the Karabiner 98K, an excellent rifle for 1918. The Americans carried something else. Something that shot faster than we could think. We would identify an American position, begin our assault, and before we crossed half the distance, 3 men would be dead. Not from machine guns, from rifles. Your soldiers shoot like our machine gunners. Every one of them. Every single one." The Ardennes, December 1944. Hitler's last offensive caught the Americans by surprise, but the Grande helped prevent surprise from becoming catastrophe. At Bastogne, at Elsenborn Ridge, at St. Vith, outnumbered American defenders held positions against German forces that should have swept them aside. The mathematics that had failed at Kasserine failed again. Attacking infantry could not cross open ground against the volume of defensive fire that Garand-equipped Americans produced. Oberstleutnant Joachim Peiper, commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper and one of the most aggressive officers in the Waffen-SS, submitted an assessment after the failure of his armored thrust toward the Meuse River. Infantry operations against American defensive positions have become prohibitively costly. The enemy's rifle fire suppresses movement across open terrain even when our numerical advantage is 3-1 or greater. Attack must be supported by armor or overwhelming artillery preparation. Direct infantry assault, tactics which succeeded against the Soviets and the British, fail consistently against American forces. Their individual weapon provides each soldier with firepower equivalent to a light machine gun. Until this advantage can be neutralized, offensive operations in this sector should prioritize armored breakthrough over infantry maneuver. The advantage was never neutralized. German weapons designers scrambled to respond. The Gewehr 43, a semi-automatic rifle rushed into production in 1943, was supposed to match the Garand's capabilities. It was heavier, less reliable, and produced in numbers so small, barely 400,000 compared to over 4 million Garands, that most German infantry never saw one. The Sturmgewehr 44, the revolutionary assault rifle that would influence weapons design for decades, arrived too late and in too few quantities to matter. The Wehrmacht fought the war's final year with the same bolt-action Karabiner 98K that had seemed adequate in 1940. It was no longer adequate. The German soldier in his foxhole, working his bolt between shots, listening to the continuous roar of American rifle fire, knew it was no longer adequate. He knew because he could hear the difference, and increasingly, it was the last sound he ever heard. The numbers accumulated like a verdict. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced 5,468,772 M1 Garand rifles. Every single one was shipped to a theater of war. Every single one was placed in the hands of an American soldier, sailor, or marine. By comparison, Germany produced approximately 14 million Karabiner 98K rifles during the entire war, but spread across 4 years, multiple factories, and a front that stretched from Norway to North Africa to the gates of Moscow. American production was concentrated, focused, relentless. One rifle, one design, one purpose. The rifle consumed ammunition at rates that validated every pre-war German prediction about logistical strain, and then rendered those predictions irrelevant through sheer industrial capacity. American forces in the European theater of operations expended approximately 2.5 billion rounds of .30-06 ammunition. Billion. The number is almost incomprehensible. Enough bullets to kill every soldier in the Wehrmacht 6 times over. Enough brass casings to pave a road from New York to Los Angeles. The logistics system that Major General McNair had feared would collapse under semi-automatic consumption instead delivered ammunition in quantities that made German supply officers weep with envy. The kill ratios told their own story. In infantry engagements across Western Europe, American rifle companies consistently inflicted casualties at rates 2 to 3 times higher than they received, even when attacking fortified positions, even when outnumbered, even in terrain that favored the defense. The advantage was not armor. It was not artillery. It was not air support, though Americans had plenty of all three. The advantage was visible in the simplest possible metric. The rate at which individual American soldiers put bullets into individual German soldiers. We examined captured German positions after actions throughout the campaign, wrote Colonel S.L.A. Marshall in his landmark study of infantry combat. The disparity in expended brass was consistent and striking. German defensive positions showed cartridge casings consistent with aimed, deliberate fire. 5 to 8 casings per man, per hour of engagement. American assault positions showed casings in the hundreds, sometimes thousands, per man. The Garand allowed our soldiers to maintain rates of fire that suppressed German defenses continuously, without pause, without the rhythm of bolt manipulation that had historically allowed defenders to return accurate fire. But statistics were abstractions. The truth lived in the words of the men who had faced the Garand and survived to describe it. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division and one of the most experienced armored warfare officers in the Wehrmacht, was captured in April 1945. His interrogation at the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center produced an assessment that American intelligence officers quoted for decades afterward. The American infantry is not superior in training or motivation. Your soldiers do not have the experience of our veterans, nor the ideological commitment of the Waffen-SS. But every American rifleman has a weapon that fires as fast as he can pull the trigger. This single fact negates every advantage we possess in small arms tactics. Our doctrine was built on the assumption that machine guns provide suppressive fire while riflemen maneuver. Against Americans, every rifleman provides suppressive fire. There is no pause in which to maneuver. There is no rhythm to exploit. There is only continuous fire, and our soldiers die while working their bolts. Major Wilhelm Keller, operations officer of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the fanatical Hitler Youth Division that had fought from Normandy to the Ardennes, provided testimony that revealed the psychological dimension of the Garand's impact. My soldiers were young. They believed in final victory. They did not fear death, but they feared the American rifle. I watched men who would charge a machine gun nest hesitate before crossing ground covered by American riflemen. They had learned what that rifle could do. They had seen their comrades cut down not by automatic weapons, but by what sounded like automatic weapons. 8 shots in 2 seconds, again and again, from every American position. The mathematics we had learned said that attacking riflemen had the advantage over defending riflemen because attackers could concentrate fire while defenders were spread thin. Against the American rifle, this mathematics reversed. The defenders could generate so much fire that concentration became suicide. Feldwebel Konrad Eisner, the same sergeant who had reported fighting an American company at Oran in November 1942, survived the war. Captured in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945, he encountered Captain William Henderson of the U.S. Army Historical Section, who was collecting German testimonies about American weapons and tactics. Eisner's statement closed a circle that had opened 2.5 years earlier on a Tunisian road. In Africa, I believed I had faced a reinforced company. I reported this to my commanding officer, who told me I had panicked, that I had faced only a patrol. He was correct. I had faced only a patrol. 8 men, perhaps 10, with rifles that fired faster than I could count. I did not panic, Herr Hauptmann. I simply did not understand what I was hearing. Now I understand. Your rifle, the Garand. It gave every American soldier the firepower of a squad. We faced this rifle for 3 years. We never found an answer to it. Our rifles were accurate. Our machine guns were superior. Our soldiers were brave. But your rifle changed what infantry combat meant. A German soldier with a carabiner was a rifleman. An American soldier with a Garand was something else. Something closer to a machine gun team that could run, take cover, and fire from any position. We could not match this. We could not counter this. We could only die against it, and we died in numbers I still cannot accept. The highest-ranking German officer to comment on the Garand was General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Wehrmacht High Command, who signed the unconditional surrender at Reims on May 7, 1945. In the weeks following his capture, Jodl submitted to extensive interrogation about the conduct of the war. His assessment of American infantry weapons was included in a classified intelligence summary. German industry attempted to respond to the American semi-automatic rifle, but we began too late and produced too few. The Gewehr 43 was inferior. The Sturmgewehr was excellent, but arrived when the war was already lost. Meanwhile, every American infantryman carried a weapon that fundamentally altered the dynamics of small unit combat. We could match American armor. The Panther was superior to the Sherman. We could match American artillery. Our 88mm guns were the best in the world. We could not match the fact that every American soldier, every private with 6 weeks of training, could produce suppressive fire that required a 2-man machine gun team in our army. This advantage compounded across millions of soldiers, thousands of engagements, 3 years of war. It was not the only reason we lost. It was one of the reasons we could not win. Jean-Cantius Garand, the Canadian immigrant who had spent 17 years perfecting his design, lived until 1974. He never served in combat. He never fired his rifle at another human being, but he received letters from soldiers throughout the war and for decades afterward. Letters thanking him for the weapon that had brought them home. He kept everyone. May 1945, a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt, Germany. Konrad Eisner sat on a wooden bench outside the processing center, waiting for the paperwork that would determine whether he would be released or transferred to a labor battalion. He was 41 years old. He had served in the Wehrmacht for 6 years. He had fought in Poland, France, North Africa, Italy, and finally Germany itself, retreating step by step from an empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga. An American private walked past, his M1 Garand slung casually over his shoulder. The soldier was young, 19, perhaps 20, with the soft face of someone who had never known hunger. He didn't glance at Eisner. Why would he? The war was over. The Germans were defeated. The rifle on his shoulder was just equipment now, a tool for guard duty, no longer the instrument of death it had been for 3 years. Eisner watched the rifle until the soldier disappeared around a corner. He thought about Oren, about the road outside the city where he had positioned his squad for what should have been a simple ambush, about the sound that had erupted from the American patrol, that impossible, continuous roar that had convinced him he faced a company when he faced only a handful of men, about Hauptmann Brandt telling him he had panicked, that the Americans carried Springfield rifles just like the German carabiner, that there was nothing special about enemy infantry. Brandt was dead now. Killed at Anzio by American rifle fire, according to the men who had served with him. Eisner wondered if he had heard the same sound in his final moments, the sound of 8 rounds fired faster than a man could breathe, the sound that had haunted German soldiers from Tunisia to the Rhine. He had carried his carabiner 98K for 6 years. He had trusted it. It had never failed him, but in every engagement against Americans, he had felt the disparity, the terrible mathematics of a weapon that required 4 separate motions between shots, facing a weapon that required only a trigger pull. He had learned to keep his his head down when Americans returned fire. He had learned to wait for artillery or armor before advancing. He had learned in the most visceral way possible that the rifle he carried was a generation behind the rifle he faced. The Americans had not won because they were braver. German soldiers were brave. The Americans had not won because they were better trained. Wehrmacht infantry training was the finest in the world. The Americans had won, in part, because they had given every soldier, every 19-year-old private with soft cheeks and no experience of hunger, a weapon that multiplied his effectiveness threefold. It was such a simple thing, a rifle that loaded itself, a mechanism that eliminated 4 motions between shots, a design perfected by an immigrant in a Massachusetts factory who had understood, decades before the generals, that the future of infantry combat belonged to whoever could put the most bullets downrange in the shortest time. Such a simple thing, and it had helped destroy an empire. The M1 Garand remained the standard American infantry rifle until 1957, when it was replaced by the M14, itself a direct descendant of Garand's design. The operating principles he pioneered in 1936 continue to influence military rifle design today. Every modern assault rifle, every battle rifle, every semi-automatic weapon carried by soldiers around the world owes something to the Canadian toolmaker who refused to accept that the bolt-action rifle was good enough. But the Garand's true legacy cannot be measured in technical specifications or production numbers. It lives in the testimony of the men who faced it, the German soldiers who learned to fear a sound, who watched their tactical doctrine fail against an enemy that could shoot back faster than they could aim, who discovered that individual courage meant nothing when the mathematics of firepower had turned against them. They had been told the Americans were soft. They had been told American industry produced quantity without quality. They had been told that German discipline and German machine guns would always prevail against Western armies. They had been told wrong. In November 1942, a German sergeant crouched behind a stone wall in Tunisia, listening to a sound he could not explain, convinced he faced a company of American soldiers. He faced 8 men. 8 men with 8 rifles that fired as fast as they could pull the trigger. By May 1945, that sergeant sat on a bench in a defeated nation, watching American privates walk past with those same rifles slung over their shoulders. The war was over. The sound had stopped, but he would hear it for the rest of his life, in dreams, in memories, in the silence of peacetime that could never quite erase what he had learned on a road outside Oran. The Americans had a rifle that made every soldier an army, and against that rifle, the conquerors of Europe had become the conquered.